Ulverscroft and Boldwood present The Assistant, written by Amanda Reynolds and read by Joan Walker with Rose Robinson. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Lexington Gardens. Pilot script. First draft. Fade in. Exterior location number 1. A grand London street in Belgravia. 1st of April. Day. A line of icing sugar Georgian townhouses of grand proportions shimmers in the spring sunshine. A light dusting of unseasonable snow making them glitter. The camera pans down the street until it lands on the number 56, painted in neat font on a white pillar of a house near the far end of the exclusive street, then up to the glossy black front door, where a mature woman's hand tentatively lifts the polished brass door knocker and releases it. We don't see her, just the hand, devoid of rings, the skin aged, a slight tremor detectable. Narrator VO. It was late 2022 when I first met Gail Frost. An unremarkable woman, eccentric even, in that great British tradition. Socially awkward, prickly, defensive. But I was soon sloughing off my preconceptions, which were purely superficial and based mainly on her unkempt appearance and reduced circumstances, as well as those terrible photos printed of her and salacious headlines. I interviewed her in the dank bedsit she was renting in Reading. An awful place, mould on the walls. She was lucid, intelligent, and entirely compelling throughout the lengthy interview process. The camera watches the grand door as the unseen woman waits for it to open, her breaths ragged, sounds of her clearing her throat. Then the camera looks up to the very top floor and a roof terrace, lingering there until it snaps back to the door. She knocks again, louder this time, and then we hear sounds of footsteps approaching from the other side. A figure is visible through the small sliver of obscured glass. Someone is unlocking the door. Narrator VO. Gail and I were to meet many times over the following weeks and then months. I quickly set aside the opinion I had formed of her based on what I'd read in the tabloid press. I would ask you to do the same. Come to her story with fresh eyes. Come to her story with compassion. As this series airs, I would ask you again, Gail, to be in touch. We care about you. We want to help you. Screen fades to black as Gail's quote types, one word at a time. We are rarely brought down by a nemesis exacting revenge. Those scenarios exist only in stories. Bad ones at that. No. The dispiriting but prosaic truth is, we are our own worst enemies. Gail Frost, November 2022. Scene 1. The large front door to Lexington Gardens opens. We see the two women meet face to face for the first time.
Chapter 1. Interview with Gail Frost, Sunday the 2nd of October. What do I remember of that time back in April? Well, everything, of course, as if it were yesterday. How the icy air funneled into my nose and mouth and shocked my lungs, and the grate of a metal gate being opened to the residence gardens across the road, a very ugly dog pulled through it, and my first glimpse of the long row of 5-story mansions. And how very beautiful that spring morning was, and so quiet, a slice of blue sky as the snow clouds cleared above Lexington Gardens. As if even the weather on the first day of April knew better than to play the fool at the home of Larissa Elroyd Fox, or Riss, as you probably know her better. Number 56 was within 30, maybe 40 paces of me, but I do have a short stride. Not that I've measured it, but I've been told so repeatedly in my younger days. Although wouldn't every child walk slowly compared to an adult? Sorry, where was I? Oh yes, Lexington Gardens. One of London's most magnificent Georgian terraces, right in the heart of Belgravia, the home of the rich and powerful, and impostors, like Riz. She was 32 when she met a multi-millionaire 20 years her senior. Not the 20-something ingenue you might have assumed from the lurid headlines and paparazzi photo ops. A cocktail waitress turned pseudo-celebrity turned influencer, whatever that means. The bimbo who'd somehow bagged Miles Fox of the Fox Hotel empire. A handsome man in his 50s, lured away from his family by the fake smile and the fake lips and the fake boobs, head turned by trickery. Number 56 cost the newlyweds £20 million just over 2 years ago. Not an improbable amount for one of the most prestigious addresses in London. But even so, would you spend £20 million on a home for 2 people? It's obscene, in my opinion. Think of the good you could do with that kind of money. How much difference it would make in the right hands. Most people won't earn a fraction of that in their whole lives. I certainly won't. Lord only knows what it's worth now, with all the effort and money lavished on it. The transformation of house and owner chronicled in prolific and excruciating detail via Riz's social media accounts. Because did it even exist if not? The ultimate irony in a tale which could very much be subtitled, "Be careful what you wish for." For notoriety has brought Riz what she always wanted, but what was it she needed? Oh, don't look at me like that, as if I don't know what I'm talking about. I've witnessed that same condescension on other journalists' faces, the ones who came before you, knocking hard at the door I opened for you this grey Sunday. Don't make me regret that decision, casting doubt on my words as they did, twisting their meaning to make me out to be a fantasist or losing my marbles. I am just about to turn 57, not 107. I have all my faculties, and I am the only one who saw what happened first hand. We both know what wealthy people are capable of. The rich, especially the nouveau riche, are not only entitled, but they are careless, and they stop at nothing. The likes of you and I, we are inconsequential, but we are ignored at our peril. Am I right? Of course I am. You know I lived in during the week whilst I was in Riz's employ. The flat came with the job of executive assistant. Another basement, yes, but it was very different to here. Pristine, not a spot of mould in sight. Nothing grand, mind you, but a bijou pleasant abode and the perfect location to observe and plan. Both talents I have honed over many years. I may not have a university degree or a decent employment record, but I have other transferable skills, the ability to melt into the background, for instance, as I did that first day. No doubt immediately forgotten by the only observers to my arrival, that ridiculous dog and its owner, a sulky teen who dragged it through the park gate. I was of no import, and certainly no interest, to either of them. The reverberating sound of metal clanging shut as the gate closed. The gardens locked at all times. Security, of course, is always a concern, but especially somewhere as desirable and moneyed as Lexington Gardens. The lower-level windows are grilled on most of the houses, ensuring no vulnerable point of entry, but not at 56. It would spoil the curbside appeal, according to one of Riz's mid-renovation posts. A rather unwise share, wouldn't you say? But people give away all manner of information without even thinking, and all the houses have sophisticated-looking alarm systems. The code to number 56 will likely have been changed by now if Riz has any sense at all, which is debatable, but I'm sure Hubs, as she always so horrifically referred to him, will have taken the necessary precautions. The alarm made a horrible sound that one time I set it off. Ear-splitting, not something I'd care to repeat, but any noises were distant as I approached my future home that crisp morning. The hum of traffic, the far-off drone of a pneumatic drill, a snatch of birdsong, then a siren wailing, but muted in the distance, as if the city knew its place as much as I felt mine. Other than an occasional passing van or car, the only sounds came from me. My breaths, short and staccato, an internal mantra keeping time with my heartbeat. Don't go back, don't give up, not now, not now. And of course a flutter of delight as I spotted the 2 pillars framing the door, as well as the pristine coir mat and an ornate metal boot scraper found in Portobello Market. All so identifiable from Riz's doorstep snaps. The covered porch cloistering the entrance is imposing enough to repel all but the most persistent of callers. The door is also very impressive. Hard to explain unless you've been there, but it looms over you with its deep gloss black. The mirror-shine gold knocker catching the sun, and my eye, a catch in my heart too, as I imagine the imperative sound it would make. The attention it would draw. I must admit my hand shook as I lifted it and let go so hesitantly the sound was barely audible. Watching the sliver of etched glass at eye level for any signs of life. I'd preempted that moment many times, planned it to the point it had already happened 1,000-fold in my imagination, but as I contemplated the majestic lion head, my scowling reflection distorted in its polished surfaces, it struck me I could simply turn around and go home, back to the safety of a life half-lived. Maybe not even half. The life I'd grown used to, but which had become of late for many reasons a compromise too far. Like a game of knockdown ginger, I must have considered the option of walking away, been tempted by its lack of jeopardy, the ease of anonymity calling to me. Another evening spent in my own company, a bowl of cereal, a trawl through the internet, notes updated with every tiny detail of my visit, plans revised to incorporate an aborted attempt and ideas jotted down of how one day I would see it through to its conclusion. The thrill of having been so close would have sustained me for a few more weeks, even months. But inevitably I would have been drawn back. There is little worse in life, after all, than being ignored. A daily occurrence for a woman of my age and means, but something that's never easy to endure. I lifted the heavy ring in the lion's mouth again and dropped it much harder this time before I could overthink it. The loud thwack of metal against metal surely announcing my presence. For good or evil, I would no longer be hiding behind a screen. Unseen, unheard. That part of my life was over. Time to become a part of the story. Chapter 2. Interview with Gale Frost, Sunday the 2nd of October. So sorry about the milk and the biscuits. I can't keep anything here, not with the damp, but the landlord won't do a thing about it. I suppose I should move on, but it's not quite that simple, not with my financial situation being as it is. I'm really not up to looking for work, you see. Not that anyone would have me, not after those headlines, and any money I was paid by those hacks, well, let's just say, what little there was is no more. Not that I'm hinting, I know you won't be paying me for these interviews. It's never been about the money, it's about getting the truth out there. So where was I? Oh yes, at her door. It was probably only 30 or 40 seconds before I heard footsteps and saw a figure approaching in the small window of etched glass. It distorts the view so you can't make out who, but I could tell someone was there, turning the lock, the door easing open. Those were the last few moments I had to reevaluate the wisdom of my intended strategy, and panic was truly setting in. I might have worked out a way to inveigle myself into Riz's home and the intention contained in that, but I had no idea whatsoever of the practicalities. My plan, such as it was, can be summed up as a vague notion of due diligence, whilst building mutual trust. It was a little more involved than that. I had bullet points. Planning is my modus operandi, but fair to say I would be winging it to some extent. There were so many variables, unknowable factors I could not incorporate into my scheme without the risk of abandoning it before it was begun. I had to be ready to flex, pouncing on chances as they arose and making them happen if they weren't readily available. Opportunities to bring Riz down from her falsely won place of immense good fortune. But first I had to get inside. So much expectation riding on that single aim of dethroning an unworthy impostor. It had been almost 3 years since Riz had first blipped on my radar, those headlines sensational and entirely compelling. The photos even more so, a scantily clad waitress pressed to the wealthy entrepreneur's side as they spilled messily from one of his trendy hotels, the disparity in their ages and situations jarring. And not only to me, social media exploded, as did the press, and the under-the-line comments. I'm sure you've read them too. The words cunning and fox featured heavily. It was all so seedy, so uncouth. I was appalled, and yet I couldn't look away, and neither could anyone else. Her rise from nobody to somebody, swift, and embraced by Riz to the max. They had been married for 2 years and 1 month when I knocked that door. I had already waited far too long, but I'd been hoping for a firm plan to form, and I suppose it was like all good ideas. As soon as it came to me, I wondered why I hadn't thought of it sooner. It was so obvious. The only appropriate justice was a reversal of that meteoric rise, a slither back down the snake. Riz must be cancelled. I'd expected a housekeeper or some such to open the door, maybe in a recognisable uniform, although, as I'm sure you've noticed from Riz's Instagram posts, at least before the account was deleted, staff were never a feature. The lady of the house very much centre stage, and invariably flying solo. It shouldn't have therefore been quite such a shock when a familiar face appeared, blinking into the sunlight. As I recall, which I do, my memory is pretty much photographic, Riz had her hair scraped back, and she wore only subtle makeup, other than those jet black brows, symmetrical arches sculpted monthly by a process bizarrely entitled lamination. Are you familiar? Yes, I suppose a woman your age would be, but it was not something I'd heard of. Fashions change, of course, and bushy is back, but only for eyebrows, not... Anyway, I digress. It was Riz at the door, and I was completely thrown by her presence. My mind emptied, as if I'd gone into a room and momentarily forgotten what it was I needed in there. I could have walked away, but that would have looked very odd, even odder than the fact I was rendered mute by those authoritative dark eyes beneath the dark brows, surveying me with scepticism and simultaneous disinterest. I simply could not summon the words I'd practised many times at this very table, talking to the wall rather than your good self. Not one of them came out, not even an excuse to turn around and leave. I was turned to stone by that look of hers, you know the one. No, I don't suppose you would, and not the mirror face she shared on Insta. That was bizarre, wasn't it? All that pouting and posing. No, this was a dead-eyed but penetrating stare, the slight tilt of her head to the right indicating not curiosity but impatience, and she was chewing gum, only pausing in her constant jawing long enough to expel a single dismissive syllable. Yes? I'd felt pleased with my appearance as I left home, the unseasonable late fall of sleety snow only dampening my spirits a little as I exited Paddington Station and walked across Hyde Park. My outfit, what I'd deem smart office wear, more than adequate for the role I was about to play, but my artificially inflated sense of self-worth, dropped several notches in comparison to the woman facing me. A particularly caustic bout of self-hatred filling the void and tainting my throat with acid bile. Although, I'll admit now, it was perhaps more a case of petty jealousy. A quick, sharp bite, rather than the slow burn of envy I'd lived with for years, corrosive in the gut, like an ulcer. My feelings of inadequacy in her presence irritating in the extreme, but not profound or as ultimately disabling as I'd feared. It's worth saying at this point that with Riz, even when I knew her better, I was always on the back foot, a deliberate and blanket strategy on her part. Not that she had any reason to doubt me on our first meeting or at any time I was in her employ, but her default position is haughty standoffishness. That's what money does, of course, amongst other things. It buys you disdain, and her wealth was certainly on show in her signature, casual look. From the laminated brows to the designer jeans and soft cashmere lounge top, which exposed one angular shoulder, it was high maintenance masquerading as the opposite. I willed the rehearsed words to spill out, but when they finally came, they tumbled so fast they were barely decipherable. She frowned, and I tried again. "Sorry, I'm here about the role of assistant. My name's Gail Frost. The agency should have been in touch with my CV." I unzipped my shoulder bag and thrust a printed version of my curriculum vitae towards her, jabbing the 6 inches or so of tanned, toned flesh she'd left deliberately exposed between jeans and cropped sweater. When you've put in that much effort, 100 stomach crunches per day, I guess you want to flaunt the results at every opportunity, but it felt too brazen. Her navel winking at me. Maybe I'm being prudish. The thought of exposing my flabby midriff is abhorrent, but that's more an age thing, I suppose. 5 years post-hysterectomy. The 4 small surgical marks are fading, but the emotional scars. Although in my younger days I had a 26-inch waist and a stomach that was, in fairness, it was never flat, but I was attractive. I was told so, by more than one man. Anyway, it seemed I'd done a reasonable job with my CV, the diligent preparation I put in saving me from a slammed door in my face. Riss unclipped some fancy-looking glasses from her sweater and read the printed sheet, both sides, nodding and remarking on my experience, lack of family ties, maturity, and she even pulled out some tiny but clever embellishments which I'd thought would appeal, like complete flexibility on hours and duties. A contrast to her recently fired executive assistant, whom Riz had tweeted was never around when I needed her. The full circumstances of the previous EA's departure were unclear, but I imagine that Riz's insecurities about her husband's wandering eye were a major factor in the attractive young woman's dismissal. She must have got her to sign a stringent non-disclosure agreement, because I checked thoroughly and she's never even as much as sub-tweeted, but she left a vacancy, which I very much hoped to fill for multiple reasons: financial, personal, moral. Although I'm not going to wrap it up in issues of feminism and socialism. This was not a crusade, at least only a personal one, but there were wider injustices, I suppose. It was very much a win-win situation, ticking many boxes. At least that was the hope. Riz then informed me I'd have to make another appointment, thrusting the crumpled sheets at me. "I'm busy and I didn't know you were coming. You'll have to speak with the agency." Fair enough, but I couldn't allow myself to be defeated quite so easily. The door was closing, and with it a very small window of opportunity. I needed to act fast, deploy my fallback position. I always have one of those. As I said, planning is my forte, and in my experience, absolutely key. I'm sure it's the same in your line of work. I mean, journalism is a slapdash industry at the best of times, but investigative journalist has a very different ring to it. Anyhow, in my desperation, I recalled a little something I had tucked away in a metaphorical pocket, ready for just such a situation. I nodded, turned as if to leave, and then turned back, finger raised, and gestured to a point across the park. Somewhere equally well-heeled, the rooftops just visible in the next Georgian square. Riz looked nonplussed, as she might, but I explained how I'd come straight from an interview at a property in that street, that she might know the woman. Then I gave Riz a name, one I'd conveniently landed on a month before. You might well know of her too. The wedding was featured in the clickbait press last summer, in one of those magazines that pays for everything in exchange for an exclusive. Column inches, Riz had similarly dominated in the heady days of her affair with her future husband. This Italian lakeside extravaganza was the subject of a very splashy exclusive, both grotesque in its excess and enthralling in its star-studded guest list. A 3-day spectacular to which Riz had very much not been invited. And believe me, I had checked and double-checked, especially as the happy couple lived nearby in a similarly excessive home, and Riz would definitely have made the most of the photo ops on her socials had she been present. She had clearly never connected with the woman, and she was the kind of friend Riz would have made a point of making and then sharing all over her carefully curated timeline, the kind of woman Riz had hoped to be, who lunched and laughed with other well-heeled wives like her, who attended charity balls and film premieres and called her acquaintances dear friends, Riz was, in that respect, as much of an interloper as I was, ostracised by the rarefied slice of London society she aspired to join but was totally excluded from. The woman's name left my lips and floated between us in the frozen air. A spiky breath of ice, well aimed, but also my last hope. It could have gone either way, my future resting on Riz's hesitation as she looked beyond me to that other woman's world, just across the park, to the lifestyle she'd coveted and thought she'd won, but which still eluded her, so near and yet so far. An expression passed across her hard features, one that I would witness many times after that, a visible manifestation of the fear of something she wanted or might want slipping away from her. She wavered, panic manifesting as a drumming of long nails against the black paint as she held the door, still barring my entrance. I was counting on her coveting something she might not be able to have, like a child denied sweets at the checkout. My apparent popularity making me an instantly more attractive prospect. She couldn't join that particular closed circle of friends, but she could snipe something one of them wanted. Just as a side issue, but I think it shines a light on that moment of indecision and how it might have gone either way. I'd been rather pleased with my raincoat, a rare find in my local charity shop and freshly dry cleaned by its kind benefactor, the ticket still safely pinned to the label, which I discovered on the train journey home, cheeks burning at my oversight. But I could tell Riz was unimpressed by my pre-loved find, her lip curling as she looked me up and down, deliberating her verdict. Much in life hangs on the smallest of things, doesn't it? A memory, a phrase that still stings, a decision made, a choice taken, not least by those two women who faced one another for the first time across the threshold, deciding if they might be colleagues, maybe even friends. Although little was, as it seemed, on either side, and she hated my coat, bought me a new one in the end. Luckily, depending on which way you now view it, Riz's expression then changed from thoughtful, or if I was being a tad unkind, resting bitch face, to that practised smile she reserved for her Instagram reels, the one where all her white veneers were on show, and her eyes sparkled, hair glossy as a pony's, the dewy glow of her skin so covetable that the previous autumn I had blown a whole month's food budget on a pot of her must-have recommended face cream and spent weeks surviving on cold baked beans. That's the power of being someone like Riz. A power she wielded with little thought for those drawn to her, moths to a flame, and I count myself amongst those misled by the thin sheen of glamour, my smile as wide as hers as she opened the door and invited me into her beautiful home. Chapter 3. Interview with Gail Frost. Sunday, the 2nd of October. Have you ever been inside one of those enormous Belgravia townhouses? Neither had I before that moment. They are, of course, very impressive, but number 56 was something else. From the moment I went through the door, the scope and grandeur were breathtaking. The hallway was perhaps the most arresting part of the house, with its marble flooring and glittering chandeliers and the sweep of the staircase, as though you'd entered another world just in those few steps up from the pavement. A palatial promise of more to come, so much more. Such a short residence, sadly, and yet I felt immediately as if I was meant to be there. The hall is painted white, as is the rest of the house, although one wall to your right as you go in is tiled in mirrored panels above a console table. The myriad reflections created an unsettling feeling of visibility, one I could most definitely have done without. I looked as I'd intended, non-threatening to the point of bland, but also nervous and apologetic. 56 is no age, and yet I carried every one of my years into that pristine hallway. Whilst Riz, even without full make-up, and in her mid-30s, was what my late mother would have termed striking. It was not a compliment Mum ever levelled at me, but I understood it to mean there was attractiveness but little natural beauty. A hard strike, I suppose. Arresting but not pretty, which left me with an initial impression of Riz as possessing glamour but with little, if any, warmth. Her ostentatious home was designed to astound, which it did, in spades, and in fairness so did she, but there was an emptiness to both. Riz indicated I should leave my wet coat on a bench seat strewn with the fluffy sheepskin of a large but long dead ewe. She waited whilst I disrobed, watchful as though I might defy that initial instruction and defile her home if left to my own shoddy devices. Then she requested my shoes should be slipped off, the toes of my tights darkened with damp, which I sincerely hope she did not mistake for perspiration, as it was in fact a combination of wet weather and worn shoes. Her feet were bare, red-tipped toes splayed on the cold tiles beyond the doormat. She has large feet, size 8, long and thin, the bones visible, a bunion on one from always wearing heels. I laid the coat down with care. It felt a significant moment, a flag placed in the ground. I was there, at last, the sheep's sacrifice and mine interwoven. Within touching distance of everything I'd coveted for so long, so close I could taste success as I followed her across the brightly patterned rug on the promise of a coffee and a chat in the kitchen. She was at pains to convey a spontaneous but professional approach, and I did my best to reflect that back, although I was hyper-aware of my every movement as I took those first few stockinged paces. Walking becoming a conscious action. I tripped on the rug and she spun round, asked if I was okay, but her tone indicated not being so would be an annoyance. I assured her I was perfectly fine, although my heart was pounding and cold sweat covered my back. The reassurance I gave her of normality was my first outright lie, other than the invented job offer, yes, and a wildly fabricated employment history. But put yourself in my shoes, or rather tights, I was hardly going to concede my inner turmoil. My chatter should I have allowed it to leave my thoughts, giddy to say the least, and her irritation at my clumsiness was not aiding my composure. It's silly, isn't it, how certain people unsettle us so. The censorious teacher whom we can never shake off, the parent whose critical voice follows us into adulthood, even from beyond the grave. I can generally hold my own, but Riz had that effect on me right from the start. Like I said, I was always on the back foot with her. The physical chasm in our situations, clearly seismic, would be disconcerting for anyone. Although as I moved deeper into her home, my initial reaction turned from stunned awe to, how shall I put this, comforting familiarity. Very odd, I agree, but I'd liken it to travelling to an iconic location, somewhere you've seen in films, read about, looked up on Google. You recognise what's before you, and yet you can't quite believe you're there. And it felt as if everything had slowed down, allowing me to experience my new surroundings in micro-detail. Not exactly déjà vu, but, yes, familiarity. I don't suppose it's that surprising, given I'd avidly followed the renovations since Riz had found her #forever home 2 years earlier, just after she was married. Yes, but I was on unfamiliar territory. I so rarely visit London, let alone Belgravia. That teddy over there on my bed. Yes, the one with the Harrods 2007 on its foot. That was bought for me on a rare sightseeing trip with a friend, but I could count on one hand the times I ventured into town, as Mum always called it. I find London noisy and dirty. My skin always feels grimy after I've been there. It might only be 22 minutes by train, as you say, but you and I meeting on a Paddington-bound trip was a very fortunate coincidence. Like I said to you at the time, I rarely have reason to go into the city, but I did love living at Lexington Gardens. It's so incredibly luxurious, although not entirely to my taste, with splashes of Riz's rather ostentatious choices creeping in here and there, the pink velvet sofas, a peacock head on the sitting-room wall, but thankfully she'd relied heavily on the better judgment of professionals. A long and expensive process, the redecoration chronicled in overly zealous detail on Riz's social media. Every designer who couldn't fulfill her vision, or builder who traipsed dust across the newly restored original floorboards, named and shamed. She went through them at a similar rate of knots to assistants. A new one praised, and then gone before I'd had time to fully research their backstory. For a while it felt as though Riz's Instagram content had morphed into an episodic version of one of those awful makeover shows which proliferated back in the day. But the work was eventually completed, and aside from occasional extravagant purchases, or pieces, as Riz pretentiously referred to them, she returned to her favourite subject, Riz. And her loyal followers were rewarded for their supportive comments during the renovation, with guided tours of each finished room. All 18 of them, if you include the basement. I think some of those videos are still available to watch on YouTube. You should check them out if you haven't already. Riz filmed them herself, phone held aloft, and narrated in her trademark hyperbolic manner. Everything is amazing or fantastic. From the sun-trapped roof terrace where a bit of naughty nude sunbathing took place when the weather allowed, to the cute basement quarters where her procession of assistants moved in and then all too quickly back out again, myself included. I miss living there, of course I do, but that's not why I feel the need to avail you of the facts. This story needs to be told, properly this time. I don't think it's overstating the case to say a woman is unaccounted for. Worst case scenario? I'd rather not think about that right now, but I suppose we must and we will, and soon. I know your visits are of necessity weekly, but we must act. Anyway, to get back to that first visit, it was incredible to be immersed in it all. A house I knew intimately but had never set foot inside before that moment. It was overwhelming, as I'm sure you can imagine. My familiarity with it, disconcerting. I had clicked on the shared links, of course, logged and stored and even dreamt of those purchases in those swampy nights of insomniac sweats and menopausal wakefulness. But then there I was, close enough to reach out and touch the vase on the console table or stroke the hand-painted silk cushion on the chair beside it. Not that I did, I simply stared, most likely slack-jawed as I allowed it all to sink in. And the hallway smelt divine, it always did, a heady mix of the lilies in the vase and the diffusers placed either side of the gorgeous flowers. Expensive diffusers, of course, nothing too tacky. Other than her, Riz might have lacquered over the past, but her provenance was there for all to see. Plumped lip curled as she waited for me to catch up after my unfortunate trip and follow her into the kitchen. I then clambered up, or tried to, onto the stool she'd offered me, taking the opportunity to grab onto the kitchen island for support, whilst Riz turned her back to see to the offered refreshments. The same island where she'd once given a long tutorial about how to make a porn star martini to die for. It truly was a sensory overload. The long but narrow room filled with every designer gadget and top-of-the-range appliance you might imagine. A world I'd coveted and studied and lived vicariously every day for the previous 2 years. It seemed ridiculous it had taken me this long to work up the courage to come here. This long to devise a way to not only be at Lexington Gardens, but also take what was rightfully mine. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. It might illustrate my purpose more effectively for you. The vase I mentioned on the console in the hall, it is very pretty. Pale blue with impressions of white fluffy clouds circling it, and it's always filled with those long-stemmed calla lilies, petals like creamy champagne flutes. You know the kind often found in wedding bouquets and hotel lobbies. I'd imagine they cost at least £5 a stem, maybe twice that, possibly more, I have no idea. But the price was obviously not an issue. A new bunch, delivered weekly, the old ones tossed away by the cleaners unless I managed to salvage them first. The flower shop is only a few streets away, door-painted lilac and surrounded by baskets of blooms, hand-tied bouquets upwards of £50, and that scent. If I pass a florist, any florist, it takes me straight back to those beautiful lilies. Such a contrast from the damp smell in this place. Anyway, the vase cost £7,000. 7,000. You know my weekly budget for food? £15. That vase could feed me for almost 10 years. One vase. A vase I could have tipped and smashed with a glancing blow any day as I walked past. A vase that Riz, I'm convinced, barely ever noticed. So if I wanted to turn the tables finally and dethrone the imposter, then no, I don't think that was so wrong of me. What you have to ask yourself, as I did many times, why her? Why should she get so lucky? Why not me? That's the premise I began this journey with, and although I may have failed in some respects, I will not give up on what has now become so much more than a simple balancing of the books. For this is not driven by envy or retribution, or whatever else is going through your head, as I begin to explain what's really happening to that missing woman. It's about so much more than that. It's about a crime so heinous, and yet so unbelievable, that it seems I am the only one who can expose it. With your help, I hope.
Email subject: Interviews with Gail Frost. Date: Thursday the 6th of October. Hey, so nice to meet you the other day, and thanks for offering to take a look at my notes from Sunday. I had no idea you and I had a mutual script agent, and you were also looking for a true crime project. And thanks so much for the feedback on the first interview with Gail. We plan to meet up weekly. She says there is some urgency, but won't be drawn on exactly what that means. I have to keep on with the day job at the magazine, so, boundaries. Can't be with her all day every day. She's my jumping-off point for this story, but a good one, I think. I find it fascinating what she chooses to tell me, and even more, chooses to leave out. Very much an edited and, in some ways, I suspect, fantastical version of what happened between her and Riz at Lexington Gardens. Gail is adept at glossing over her misdeeds and justifying her actions every which way. But she's not your typical conspiracist either, or even the hacked-off ex-employee turned tattletale the tabloids have made her out to be. She's a bit odd, for sure, but I haven't written her off as a complete nutjob. Not quite yet. She's certainly not motivated by money, thank goodness, as I have no budget. This is my pet project, not for the magazine. My editor's not interested, and I'd rather keep it as mine. Especially now we're talking scripts, always an ambition. It's very early days, as you said yourself, and maybe Gail's all those things, and this will be less revealing than hoped. But I don't think so. And thanks so much for agreeing to read more. I must admit, when I was subbing the idea to our agent, after I met Gail on a train of all places and my boss had told me it was a non-starter, I had no idea he would send it to you with all your amazing connections and previous projects. I've been such an admirer of your drama documentaries. What a stroke of luck. Script writing has been my back burner project for years, a dream of mine, but the day job is editorial copy. Let's hope the stars align. I saw it more as a deep dive long read, but your vision for it is much more exciting. So yes, of course, I'd love to explore the idea of bringing it to a wider audience. And I totally get your point about diluting the message, but I do think I need to go as wide as possible in my research. I'm tracking down all the major players who were at 56 Lexington Gardens when Gail was Riz's executive assistant, from early April to the night of the infamous book launch party on the 16th of June, for corroboration as well as background. I am also, as you advise, very much taking Gail's words with a mighty pinch of salt. She has her own agenda. That much is abundantly clear. She's making some wild claims, then failing to either substantiate or fully reveal them. Heinous crimes. A missing woman. Intriguing, but who knows? I'll hang in there for the ride, but appreciate any steers. What do you envisage as next steps? Best wishes. A. Kiss.
Chapter 4. Second interview with Gail Frost, Sunday the 9th of October. Sorry about the tea. It's impossible to keep anything in this place. The damp spores. Don't feel you have to drink it. So where was I when we ended our interview last week? Oh yes, Riz and I were in the kitchen and she was making coffee, well, dropping a pod in a machine, but she must have noticed me looking around, drinking in my surroundings as well as that delicious aroma as it dripped into the cup, because she took it upon herself to then explain the renovations. How the house was Grade 2 listed, and that the work she had overseen needed to be in keeping, naturally. I didn't care for the patronising lecture, my knowledge of her home encyclopedic, but I hope I looked suitably enthralled, despite the fact I could have recited the sales brochure to her word for word. A complete renovation will be required, but once completed, 56 Lexington Gardens will provide the owners with a stunning family home in one of Belgravia's. That would have freaked her out, wouldn't it? So useful when documents remain online in perpetuity, don't you think? For you too, I suspect, in your line of work. And as a side note, the only garden, a small courtyard, very high brick walls and dominated at its centre by the most magnificent magnolia tree, is only accessible via the basement flat where I would soon live. I hadn't had a garden in years, and I loved it. Used to open the patio doors every morning, rain or shine, and step out barefoot onto the cobbles, coffee in hand, the damp or warmth settling on my upturned face beneath the dappled shade of that glorious tree, eyes closed, heart full. Such lovely memories. Anyway, getting ahead of myself again. We were in the kitchen and nothing had been decided, but it was looking very hopeful. I was balanced on one of the two teal leather-backed stools, the only pop of colour, against the bank of floor-to-ceiling white cabinets, my feet finding the footrest moments before Riss handed me my hot coffee. A glass of filtered water poured from the tap for herself. She avoided caffeine and refined sugar, her long slim wrists swathed in bangles and, of course, sporting the ubiquitous smartwatch. She owned 3 of them. 1 on, 1 charging, and a spare. Everything she did had to be tracked, you see, even in her sleep. She slid onto the stool beside me with ease, her legs so much longer and lither than mine. Laptop opened up, fingerprint recognized, lean thighs crossed, red varnished toes pressed to the side of the island like dots of blood spatter in a crime scene. The overpowering scent of her favoured Jo Malone perfume, pomegranate noir, suffocating me. It's a beautiful scent, I agree, but she always sprayed herself in clouds of it. I begged for a freebie at the department store concession when I was sent to buy more, but the tiny sample ran out after barely 2 pumps. I confess to then helping myself to the odd spritz of hers, but I'd hardly describe it as theft, not when she sprayed it round like air freshener, a new bottle purchased each time they'd almost ran out. I kept the leftovers, squirreled them away in my bathroom cabinet, but I'm sad to say I left them behind. Not the only casualty of a hasty exit, but still rather a sad loss. She often sent me on errands to the beauty counters nearby, not only for perfume but other cosmetics, as well as requests for packs of gum, tights, cans of diet energy drink, anything that popped into her head. There was a large Boots chemist close by, or the department stores in Kensington. Very convenient. I was the dog's body, but I rarely minded. All part of the remit as far as I was concerned, and far from the worst part of the role. Plus, it got me out of the house, which was a blessed relief at times, particularly towards the end. Anyway, that first time at the kitchen island I sipped the black Americano. Far too bitter for my taste. I prefer a drop of milk. But it had felt the right choice, and Riss donned her Prada reading glasses, then angled herself and her laptop away from me and read from what sounded like a pre-prepared script. A series of questions and prompts she recited robotically, and between which the words I'd rehearsed slotted in reasonably well. I was quite impressed with myself, especially as I had no physical aide-memoire as she did, relying on the fading grey matter and caffeine hits alone. It wasn't easy, mind. There were so many distractions, not least her constant gum-chewing, dazzling veneers causing a slight crowding of the mouth, so some of her sounds weren't crisp. Plus, I kept noticing details around the room I recognised from her posts. The row of gifted cookbooks above the hob from which she'd begun her clean-eating obsession, and the photos of her in various exotic locations, hung gallery-like on the wall behind her. The bikinis she favoured cut so high they bordered on obscene. I must have hesitated in one of my responses. I don't recall over which question in particular, but she frowned, and then we continued on regarding my education. I went to an all-girls school, and work experience, secretarial, then personal assistant to various well-to-do employers, too numerous to list them all. And hobbies, mainly reading, knitting, walking, the kind of neutral interests that wouldn't impact a potential employer. It was a melting pot of truth and invention, as all the most credible accounts must be. Although I do recall improvising an interest in skiing when a photo of Riss in a vivid pink all-in-one at the top of a mountain caught my eye. I was banking on the fact by ski season I would no longer be in her employ, my plan executed by then. Yes, I had some fun along the way, but mainly it was a demonstration of the art of flattery, getting one through most situations. None of us is immune to it, and Riz lapped it up. Me playing my part as a well-travelled spinster, dedicated to the cause of satisfying her future employer's every whim and whimper to an absolute T. Call it exaggeration if it sits with you better, but I'm not alone in massaging the truth to gain a job. Everyone does it to a greater or lesser degree. I'm sure you have too. I meant no harm, not in that regard. I simply supplied what she needed, her ideal executive assistant, at least on paper, with the added incentive she would be swiping me from the clutches of one of the Belgravia set who'd so royally snubbed her on account of her husband's stealing reputation. Rather unfairly, you think? Perhaps. As you say, she had only stolen a husband that once, and there was no cause to think she would do it again, but there are no second chances, or I suspect first chances either, with the likes of the first Mrs. Fox and her chums. Trudy had made sure Riss was persona non grata from the first whisperings of Miles's affair, having something of a head start in the race to win friends and repel enemies. Trudy was from old money, you see, of many generations, and whatever anyone would rather believe, that kind of pedigree still counts amongst the top strata of British society. To put it succinctly, Trudy had completely obliterated her successor's aspirations of joining the Belgravia set. Revenge, no doubt, sweet and cold. Another interesting detail you might want to include in your article is that the Prada glasses Riz wore, the ones she popped on at the door and again as she interviewed me in the kitchen, and often featured when she posed for selfies at her desk in the upstairs study, were made of clear glass. No prescription required. I found that out when I tried them on whilst borrowing her laptop one day shortly into my employ, hoping they might magnify the figures on screen, which of course they didn't. Not a jot. The glasses were purely for show, although I have to say the frames worked well with her angular features, but of no practical value whatsoever. Appropriate, wouldn't you say, and a fitting allegory for their owner? Yes, I studied Riss carefully during that interview, comparing the social media version with close-quarters actuality as she talked at length about herself, something she enjoyed very much. It was almost as if she was a little girl play-acting at being the boss, and I was taking the part of a dull interviewee. My initial observations of her appearance, you mean? I was shocked by how thin she was, and despite the bluster, I'd say she was nervous. She's always been portrayed as overly confident by the press, right from those first sightings beside Miles Fox. But I discerned an unexpected anxiety. Barely there, but it lent a chink of vulnerability, the crack in the vase that let in some light, as the saying goes. Maybe it was that which had secured her a relatively healthy fan base even back then. Roughly 100K on Insta, I think, although after she leaked her amazing news, it ballooned very quickly to double that. And in the aftermath of the book launch party and my interviews with the tabloids, it briefly hit the lusted-after 7 figures before she then deleted all her social media accounts. That must have been a painful moment for such a publicity whore. Sorry, I've lost my thread, which is ironic as I've just recalled I did much the same at the time, zoning out as Riz waxed lyrical about her brand, which was an unfortunate lapse on my part as the brand was very much her thing. a nebulous product which she promoted at every opportunity as though she was adding value to the world beyond monetizing her good fortune even further. But I should have been paying more attention. It was central to my prospective employer's hopes and ambitions, and therefore, by extension, also to mine. How to define Riz's brand? It's tricky, as she rarely explained without overuse of idealistic platitudes, as if clarity might weaken its tenuous potency, but the idea was propped up on the linked premises of lifestyle and beauty. Basically anything which pertained to being Riz, which was, coincidentally, or maybe not, also the title of her ill-fated Lifestyle and Beauty Bible. The trouble was, as the wife of a multi-millionaire, most of her purchases were far beyond the means of us mere mortals. The vase very much a case in point, an extreme example, but there were many. Her daily consumption of eye creams, serums, perfume would have soon mounted up to the debt of a small country. Although she did have some restraint regarding shares, she would never have boasted on social media about the vase, for instance. That was too extravagant. Although the must-haves were still hugely aspirational. A conundrum which weirdly seemed to work in her favour, at least with her most devoted fans, as though wanting and having could coexist in an odd codependency of yearning. It was a perplexing dichotomy, the coming together of a have with so many have-nots. Riz's ability to flaunt yet endear, posting another $3,000 handbag or £100 a pot neck cream, a definite if questionable talent. If I'm brutally honest, I think it was morbid curiosity that drew the majority of people to her. It was different for the die-hard fans. They seemed to love her unconditionally. But for the majority of us, it was that persuasive mix of envy and fascination, the daily torture we all like to inflict upon ourselves, the if-only scenario. If only I were thinner, richer, younger. A carrot, dangled close enough, but then again far enough out of reach to drag you along in its wake, a glittering prize you never or would even want to reach. Isn't that what drives social media on the whole? You don't have to be liked to be followed. Frequently quite the reverse. You simply have to produce more and more content, whore out every aspect of your perfect life. It was certainly my experience of Riz via Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, even TikTok. God help me. The hours I wasted, equivalent to the full-time role I was applying for, except this time I was hoping to be paid handsomely. The amount as yet undisclosed. I was dying to ask. My financial situation as bad back then as it is again now. Well, almost, but we weren't quite there. Riz was still in full flow on her favourite topic. Herself. I smiled, but inside I despised and derided my host for her inflated sense of her own worth, as well as her condescension and the artificially plumped top lip. Her inability to empathise was breathtaking, her self-absorption monumental. Planet Riz, population of 1. She had no interest, concern, idea, or curiosity about me other than in relation to her. If she had paid me any attention at all, maybe she'd have noticed something was amiss. That my smile didn't reach my eyes, that I drove a thumbnail into my palm to keep alert, that everything she told me deepened my hatred, if that were even possible. It's human nature, I suppose, to critique, and we women can have a cruel streak. But she did herself no favours. It was all about her, or rather Riz, a concoction of reality and fantasy. Maybe she believed her own hype. It's very difficult to present an entirely honest account of oneself, even if you are trying to, which neither of us did that day, but her self-delusion was on another level, and strangely fascinating in its way. I'm an avid observer of people, always have been, their quirks and tics particularly illuminating. For instance, as Riz lectured me on her brand, she continually smoothed the dome of her scraped-back hair, pointed nails combing her scalp, wedding band and enormous diamond engagement ring, both slightly loose, catching the bright lights, a glimpse of that tattoo creeping from the cuff of her sweater as she smoothed the glossy ponytail. An intertwining R and M, as I recall. cherry blossom curling in and out of the connected initials on the soft, slightly paler flesh of her right inner arm. I'm not a fan of ink in general, but fair enough if you like that kind of thing. The repetitive move with her hair, however, was an annoyance. It happened too often and was so clearly deliberate. Comfortable, confident people don't feel the need to continually preen. They are understated, contained, self-possessed. Riss leaked her insecurities like a colander, and I capitalized on those, drawing in a strength from them so I could at last shrug off my nerves and face her as I had originally intended. Confident, and more than equal to the role. Equal to her, and why shouldn't I be? At least everything I have, sagging and worn as it may be, is God-given. Oh yes, work had most definitely been done. The boob job for starters, which in fairness she'd owned up to, and that ski-slope lip, but I must say she had exercised enough restraint to remain a relatively normal-looking, if highly groomed 35-year-old. I'm not going to say there hadn't been other procedures I'm not aware of, but she was not odd in the uncanny valley way some of her ilk can be. But those who, like her, shall we say, come from humble beginnings, do unfortunately show their roots in their questionable choices. The greying gum, then prized from Riz's jaw with nails like pincers, and